Thank you, Martha, and I'm glad you mentioned the most important fact at the end, which is that I am the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership. Now, my 4-year-old daughter was a little confused about my name when it was reported that my name was actually the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership. And she was confused in a way that forced me to explain a little bit about what the structure is like, and I told her that Roy Furman had dedicated a significant sum to make it possible to support research at the law school. She wasn't impressed by that. And she said, "Who is he, though?" And I said, well, described some of the things that he had done. And then it hit me, the obvious thing to say. I said, and you know, he's produced Cinderella on Broadway and might be able to get us tickets. At which point she said, "You are the coolest professor there could possibly be." And I am grateful to Roy for that ability to say. So, I want to talk a little bit about the obligation of citizens. But as is the focus of my life, because I have 3 young children, I think a lot about ethics in the context of young children. And young children think of the world as divided between bad souls and good souls. And bad souls do bad things, and good souls do good things. But what we know is, as you grow up, you begin to recognize that sometimes bad souls do good things, and sometimes good souls do bad things, or good souls do things that are bad. And as I've come to think about the problems around the issues of governance, I've increasingly thought this is precisely the frame we need to understand the institution of Congress. Not bad people doing bad things, good people working as hard as they can in a system that leads them to do bad things. I want to assume in my description of this institution of Congress that there are no criminals, there is no crime, there's nothing unethical, everything is constitutionally protected, they come with the best possible motives to the institution they serve. These are strong assumptions perhaps, but let's live with them, let's embrace them as the assumptions we carry to understand this institution. Yet, despite those strong positive assumptions, this institution has produced something we should call as corrupt. And what that does is create in us, citizens, a duty, an obligation. And that's the obligation of citizens I want to talk about today. But to introduce it, I need to tell you a story, and all stories begin something like this. Once upon a time, there was a place called Lesterland. I'm grateful to the dean that she didn't tell you this secret. It's a state secret. Please don't tell anybody. My first name is actually Lester, so I'm allowed to make fun of Lester. So I want to make fun of Lester's here a little bit, introduce this place called Lesterland. So Lesterland looks a lot like the United States. Like the United States, it has about 311 million people. And of those 311 million people, it turns out, like the United States, 144,000 are named Lester. The internet told me that, so I know it must be true. So 144,000, meaning about 0.05% of Lesterland is named Lester. Now, Lesters in Lesterland have a very interesting kind of power. There are 2 elections every election cycle in Lesterland. One election is the general election. The other election is the Lester election. In the general election, all citizens get to vote if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the Lester election, it's the Lesters who get to vote. But here's the key. To be allowed to run in the general election, you must do extremely well in the Lester election. You don't necessarily have to win, but you must do extremely well. So what can we say then about democracy in Lesterland? Well, we could say, number one, as the Supreme Court said in Citizens United, the people in Lesterland have the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there is a general election. But only after the Lesters have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the Lesters will produce a subtle, understated, maybe camouflaged bending to keep the Lesters happy. So we have a democracy in Lesterland, one dependent upon the Lesters and dependent upon the people. Competing dependencies, maybe conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the Lesters are. Okay, that's Lesterland. Now there are 3 points I want you to see now that I've set out this place called Lesterland. Here's the first. The United States is Lesterland. The United States is Lesterland. The United States also looks like this, also has 2 elections. One election we call the voting election. The second election we should call the money election. In the voting election, it's all citizens who get to vote if you're over 18, in some states if you have an ID. In the money election, it's the relevant funders who get to vote. But as in Lesterland, the trick here is to be able to run in the voting election, you must do extremely well in the money election. You don't necessarily have to win. There is Jerry Brown, but you must do extremely well. And here's the link between Lesterland and USA Land. There are just as few relevant funders in USA Land as there are Lesters in Lesterland or in USA Land. Now you say, really? Really? 0.05%? Well, here are the numbers from 2010. 2010, 0.26%, and I know we're lawyers, so numbers aren't our first calling, but I really do mean 1/4% of America gave $200 or more to any congressional candidate. 0.05% gave the maximum amount in any election cycle to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, gave $10,000 or more to any set of congressional candidates. And my favorite number from the last election cycle was 0.000042%. And if we do have a math whiz in the audience, you know that means 132 Americans gave 60% of the super PAC money that was spent in the election cycle we've just seen ending. So as a lawyer, I look at this range, 0.26, 0.05, 0.01, and I think it's fair for me to say, at the very most, 0.05% of America are the relevant funders of our campaigns. In this sense, the funders are our Lesters. Now, what can we say then about democracy in America? Well, we can say the Supreme Court, of course, was right. The people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials because there is a voting election. But only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that voting election. And number 2, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, we might say camouflaged bending to keep those funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And what we have to think about is what that does to them. As they spend their time dialing for dollars from people across the country they've never even met, trying to raise the money they need to stay in Congress. B.F. Skinner, a psychologist here at Harvard, gave us this image of the Skinner box, where the animal learns which buttons to peck in order to get the sustenance that animal needs. We need to recognize this is a picture of the modern congressman. As the congressman learns the buttons he or she must push in order to get the sustenance he or she needs. Now, it doesn't take a PhD in psychology to recognize what a life like that does. Every member develops a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what you do might affect your ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, here too we have a democracy, one dependent upon the funders and dependent upon the people, competing dependencies, conflicting dependencies, depending upon who the funders are. Okay, that's the first point. The USA is Lesterland. Here's the second point. Against the background of our traditions, a government structured like Lesterland is a corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean cash secreted in brown paper bags to members of Congress. That was a problem long ago. That's not the problem today. I don't even mean Rob Blagojevich's sense of corruption, using your power for leverage personal gain. I'm not talking about bad souls. Nothing I'm talking about is illegal. As I said, I stipulate everything is legal, everything is ethical, everything is constitutionally protected. Instead, it is still a corruption relative to our framers' baseline for how this republic was to be designed. Our framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 describes, they meant a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Now, the people. We shouldn't forget that, of course, the people in the political capacity didn't include women, it didn't include African Americans. So the framers didn't get sex and they didn't get race. But the framers got class. And I don't mean they wore fancy top hats and cool coats. I mean they understood the importance of social class inside of the society, because as Madison described in Federalist 57, in explaining who the people were, he said, not the rich more than the poor. So this was their model of government, the people and the government. I do me on slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? Extra emphasis here. The people and the government producing this exclusive dependence. But here's the problem. We've developed, they've developed, we've allowed them to develop a new dependence, a dependence upon the funders. This is a dependence too. But it's different and conflicting from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. And if anybody's not clear about this, let me make this perfectly clear. The funders are not the people. The funders are the tiniest slice of the 1%, inverting Madison's command that there not be the rich more than the poor. It is the rich more than the poor. And very important, it is not even the rich. The funders don't represent the rich. The funders are rich because they have the resources to fund, but they are not representative of the rich nor the poor. They represent interests, leveraging their power to provide special interests which are against the interests of what Madison referred to as the people. It is a corruption. It is a corruption of the dependence our framers intended our government to have. Now, there's good news and bad news about this corruption. The good news is it's bipartisan equal opportunity corruption. It blocks the left on a whole range of issues the left cares about, from climate to financial reform. It blocks the right, importantly, too. Principled people on the right who argue for objectives that the right would like to see the government adopt are blocked by the same sort of corruption. For example, people on the right talk about shrinking the size of government. When Al Gore was vice president, he had an idea to deregulate a significant chunk of the telecommunications industry. His chief lobbyist took that idea to Capitol Hill. And as the chief lobbyist described it to me, the answer they got from Capitol Hill was, hell no. If we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? So if you're from the right and you think about the idea of shrinking the government, you must recognize there's a thumb on the scale against your objective, because there is a desire to keep the government of a certain size, to have more chains to pull whenever a congressman needs to raise money. This is a system designed to save the status quo against the reforms of both the left and the right. But you might say because it's bipartisan equal opportunity, that's good news. But here's the bad news. It is a pathological, democracy-destroying kind of corruption. Because in any system where such a tiny, tiny fraction exercises such enormous power, what that means is that the tiniest fraction of that tiniest fraction, there it is, really, really tiny fraction, has the capacity to block reform. They can, and given the incentives that we've allowed to develop in this system, they will. Because DC is an economy. It's an economy with certain clear actors, with certain clear interests. Lobbyists who benefit members through the campaign contributions they can channel to them, which benefit the interests which hire the lobbyists. It's an economy. Now, that economy has changed over the last 30 years. some ways its valence has changed. Before the rise of the Tea Party, that was an economy fueled by earmarks, as Bob Kaiser describes in this really fantastic book. It was an economy that was fueled by earmarks because as the government handed out earmarks, those who benefited from the earmarks felt obliged to help those who created the earmark, and that obligation translated into fundraising opportunities and funding Congress. But around 2010, the Tea Party basically abolished earmarks, a change which I thought was fantastic when it happened because of the reasons that Kaiser had articulated. But that change had the unintended consequence of inducing a new economy, an economy of polarization, an economy of dysfunction, where dysfunction becomes the business model of Washington because, paradoxically, dysfunction makes it easier to raise money. This lobbyist shop had on its website a description of how it could use Senate holds and inside connection to the Senate to block legislation, selling the dysfunction of Congress to its clients by making it easier for them to take the opportunities they need to make sure regulations didn't get changed in the way they didn't want it to get changed. And of course, this isn't anything I need to remind you of. Just think about the shutdown that we have just seen occur. Now, whatever your position on that shutdown is, let's just keep some simple facts clear. For us, for the people, for the public, this was a very costly enterprise. S&P estimated that the cost of the economy was $24 billion. But for them, the politicians, it wasn't such a costly exercise. As Paul Blumenthal describes, both on the right and on the left, there was an extraordinary explosion in fundraising around this shutdown. Ted Cruz raised more than $1 million in the third quarter. We haven't seen the fourth quarter numbers yet, leading many to understand exactly why the talk is now of a sequel, the next funding round in January. So here are the facts. We lost billions while they raised millions. Now, there's something outrageous about this dynamic, but it's obvious and predictable given the economy of dysfunction that has developed, or the economics of dysfunction that has developed because of this corruption. Maybe good soul corruption, but corruption nonetheless. And then finally, point number 3. The fix to this problem is obvious. The analytics here are easy. The problem I'm describing here is caused by members spending too much time raising money from too tiny a slice of America. The solution is that we find a way to make it so they spend less time fundraising, but whatever time they spend it raising from a wider slice of America, to spread out the funders' influence, just as we spread out the franchise over the last 200 years, so that the funders' influence is eventually just the influence of the people alone. And to do this, we don't have to amend the Constitution. A single statute, which would be upheld even by this Supreme Court, would make it possible to spread out that funder influence, a statute that emphasized small dollar contributions from the bottom up in a way that makes it possible for candidates to run winning campaigns opting into this system of small contributions. And there are many examples of how this could be done. In my book, Republic Lost, I talk about a voucher program where every voter gets a rebate of $50 in the form of a voucher. That would be $7 billion in the system. That's 3 times the amount raised and spent in the last congressional election. Or the American Anti-Corruption Act also has a voucher provision, as well as the most ambitious ethics reform proposals that we've seen for Congress in 100 years, part of them written by Jack Abramoff. When they asked him, what would the rules had to have been for you not to be able to do what you did? He said, here are the tricks that would have made it impossible for me to achieve the corruption that I achieved. Or John Sarbanes, who has promoted this Grassroots Democracy Act that has matching funds and vouchers in it. The point is there are many models for how to do this, but all of them, each of them, would fix this problem by spreading the funders' influence broadly. The analytics are easy. It's the politics that's hard. And maybe impossibly hard, because the reality is every one of these changes would shrink the power of K Street where the lobbyists work, And what we increasingly recognize about Capitol Hill is something a graduate of this law school explained to me when I first started looking at this problem. Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, who went to Congress first in 1983, he said, "Larry, you have to understand, Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street." A farm league for K Street. Members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. So Public Citizen calculated between 98 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. And as United Republic calculated in April last year, for the members that they tracked leaving Capitol Hill for K Street, the average salary increase was 1,452%. So in a system where everybody within that beltway depends upon the system surviving, it's a fair question to ask, how is it possible for them to change this? Okay, that's where we get to obligation. The obligation of citizens. So the Chatterati describe American politics as divided between the left side and the right side. But I think the interesting division in American politics today is actually between the inside and the outside. The inside, the world inside that beltway of Washington, and the outside, the rest of America, which looks at the world inside that beltway and wonders increasingly, are they from Mars while we live on Earth? Now, when you think about the difference between insider and outsider politics, there is a politics for each of these different spheres. Following Nigel Cameron, we could call the outsider politics exopolitics. And what exopolitics means is not a politics of politicians, it's not a politics of wannabe politicians. It's a politics engaged by people who don't want to go to Washington, who don't want to become congressmen or senators or local state representatives or governors. It's a politics engaged in by citizens demanding that the politics of government change. Citizens. You. You are a critical part of this exopolitics. There are some, of course, of us who imagine going into government. I'm not talking to you. I admire you. I admire my colleague Elizabeth Warren for what she did. But I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people, I'm talking about the people who are concerned and committed to this government, who don't want to become part of it. Now, the problem that exopolitics faces is that it only ever works if it's fundamentally cross-partisan. And by that, I don't mean kumbaya, bipartisan, we all agree, because we don't all agree. There are fundamental differences across this country. But by cross-partisan, I mean that it cuts across partisan lines. That it's a politics that people on the left and the right can understand without it threatening their fundamental commitments. But right now, the exopolitics we see in America today is fundamentally polarized. Like everyone in this society, the politicians, the parties, the media, even the reform organizations, they all practice a business model of polarization. A business model that says the more we hate, the more they profit. Their interest is to drive us to recognize the crazies on the other side so we have a stronger reason to stay with them, whether that's the media or our politicians or our political parties or the reformers that we see trying to change this system. But if this is going to be solvable, we have to find a way to frame it so that it can bring together people like this and people like that. And as we've studied this issue as carefully as we can, I believe that the only frame that can bring these different worlds together is this frame around corruption. The frame that says the problem with this system is that it's become corrupted, without saying that anybody inside this system is the sort of corrupt politician that we knew during the Gilded Age. So this we must do. Now, to do this, to launch such a citizens' politics, of course, takes effort. There's no app for that. It will take incredible resources, and it takes a certain kind of courage to be willing to stand up and push in this way. Because we've all grown up in a couch potato political culture where we've professionalized politics and sent it to Washington, and we don't feel entitled or empowered or even normal if we want to engage politically without engaging in this normal, ordinary system. But we have to find a way to motivate our citizens, our fellow citizens, to stand up, to get up, and to do something about that. Now, the point that's relevant here in this community is that we do this best. We lawyers. There isn't one of you who, when you first stepped on those stairs at that library, didn't have in your mind the recognition of why you were here. It wasn't just money, although there should be some money involved with being a lawyer. This isn't the other side of the river. And it's not just truth. It's not just Dworkin, Maxwell Dworkin's office over here, right? It's not just truth, even though there's lots of truth in what we do. Everyone who stood on those steps thought the reason you came here was tied to a vision of justice. And that in your aspiration as you left here, you thought, I want to be doing justice always. So here is that chance to do justice again. To do justice again, because justice is not just about the individual. It's also justice for an institution. And it's not just an institution like a hospital or a university, but also an institution like a democracy. And your democracy needs you now. It needs you now and for a while if we're going to recover from the catastrophic dysfunction that we now see everywhere in DC. When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." A republic, a representative democracy. Government dependent upon the people alone. There's no doubt but that we have lost that republic. But all of us, especially us who learned and dreamed of doing something we call justice, all of us have to act now to help this republic get it back. Thank you very much. Do you want me to answer questions? Thank you, Charlie.